Henry was both fascinated and scared by the discovery of this strange thing under his bed. He had no idea what this was and where it came from. His father decided to call an expert to identify it, and after a few phone calls, he finally found someone who agreed to come over and take a look. The expert arrived shortly and examined it. As he inspected this thing, his face turned pale and his eyes widened with horror. Then he said, "Sir, this doesn't look well. We need to evacuate your house." Henry's parents weren't too pleased with all this chaos in their house, especially with their little boy Henry around. None of the researchers spoke a word after hearing what this thing under Henry's bed really was. At first sight, it just seemed to be a weird object, but after a thorough examination, they realized there was much more to it. There wasn't even time to pack their bags, they just needed to leave as soon as they could. But what was so dangerous about this strange-looking object? Why was the expert in such a panic, and why did they leave the house instantly? But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Like any other young kid, Henry was afraid of what may or may not be hiding under his bed. For that reason, he checked under his bed every morning. And he did the same on this Sunday morning when he suddenly spotted this strange object. He had no idea what it was, or that things would become much worse from here on. Henry was shocked and immediately ran downstairs. He yelled for his parents, but they didn't immediately respond. When he finally got their attention, he told them about his discovery. They didn't believe him at first, but when they saw the fear in his eyes, they went upstairs with him. And now, it wasn't just Henry who was in shock. His parents, Oscar and Hilly, were also totally blown away by this. They asked Henry if he really didn't put that thing there himself, but immediately saw that he was innocent. Oscar and Hilly decided to call an expert, not only to reassure Henry, but also to have that thing removed as soon as possible. The expert arrived quickly. Less than 15 minutes after they had made the call, he was already knocking on their door. Oddly enough, he didn't want to go upstairs right away. He first pulled out a photo book, showed Oscar and Hilly some pictures, and asked them whether they saw anything that resembled the strange object they had found upstairs. And they pointed to an exact match. When the expert saw what photo they pointed to, he was shocked. Suddenly, he seemed in a hurry. Henry could tell that something serious was going on, and he was very scared. The expert stepped courageously into the room and carefully looked under the bed with a flashlight. Without saying anything, he stayed under the bed for several minutes while the family waited in suspense. The expert finally rose off the ground but avoided eye contact with the family. "This is absurd," Oscar thought. He lost his temper and walked over to the man, demanding that he at least say what he saw and what made him scream. But the expert walked away, snapping at Oscar. "I need backup! Leave me alone!" Hilly wondered. Was this thing under her son's bed really that dangerous? Meanwhile, the expert finally called for backup. He tried to explain everything over the phone, but Oscar and Hilly noticed that he had to repeat himself several times. That could only mean that his backup didn't understand much of it either. Finally, the man hung up, waiting for the others to come their way. Oscar, Hilly, and Henry were asked to wait in the living room until the others arrived. They hesitantly obliged, but they wondered what the expert actually meant by backup. Not much later, the backup actually arrived. It was a whole team. They went straight to his bedroom, where they carefully began the preparations. The operation had begun, and it wasn't going to be an easy one. Men in white suits filled Henry's room. Oscar and Hilly stood by their son's door and watched in horror as the men tore up the room. But as soon as the bed was moved, the expert's colleagues were also shocked. Oscar, Hilly, and Henry could now also clearly see the object under Henry's bed. It was a shell, and it was much larger than they first thought. They still wondered what was so special about it. After carefully inspecting the shell, the team took a moment to discuss. Eventually, the team decided to call the police. Oscar was shocked. Was it that bad? Were the police really needed? He tried to talk the expert out of it, telling him it couldn't be that bad and they could solve it together, but the expert had no time for his suggestions. He had gotten irritated by the family's constant questions. Not long after, the whole house was full of cops and scientists. Meanwhile, the police officer in charge arrived. He looked around the room with a serious face and had an obligatory chat with Oscar and Hilly. Unfortunately, he had little to say and tried to reassure them with empty words. Soon after, he joined the other agents and experts. Then Oscar saw a strange reaction on one of the officers' faces. He saw how his eyes were wide open from shock. This officer clearly heard some unexpected news, and it showed on his face. Because of this, Oscar ran out of patience and he joined the group. The officers immediately stopped whispering, but Oscar didn't care. Oscar firmly demanded an answer from the officers. But as he spoke to them, all the police officers did something Oscar never saw coming. They stepped back and with a surprised look on their face, they said, "Sir, stay there. You need to lay on the ground and don't move." What is going on? Oscar thought. Oscar had no idea why he was ordered to lie on the ground, but he wasn't in a position to deny an order. So he slowly put his hands in the air and got down on his knees. Was Oscar being arrested? Why would they do something like that? Henry was taken under arms by a somewhat normal cop who treated her sweetly, and Oscar was relieved about that. Then he was put into a police car, and they also put Henry and his wife into another police car. But they were all separated. What was going on? After a few minutes, Oscar noticed a large group in white suits approaching and entering the house. Hours passed before anyone came to Oscar, leaving him to wonder what was happening. Finally, someone informed him, "We need to take you and your family with us, sir." What the heck? Was he being arrested? As the car drove away, Oscar noticed that the driver was not a police officer. It was one of those people in white suits. After a 2-hour drive, they arrived at their destination, an airport. Oscar was confused, wondering what was happening. Suddenly, he was escorted onto a waiting helicopter and taken away. He had no idea where they were going or why, but the fear and uncertainty made his heart race. As Oscar flew through the air, his mind raced with questions. Where were they taking him? Was his family there already? Despite his curiosity, he knew asking questions was useless. No one would answer him anyway. But to his surprise, suddenly, a man spoke up. "We're almost there, just 5 minutes away." Suddenly, he felt the helicopter descend. He looked down but couldn't make out the shapes below. What was this place? Soon after, Oscar arrived at a base camp that seemed like a military camp, but there was something different about it. He had never seen anything like it before. The strange equipment and unfamiliar faces left him with an uneasy feeling. They whisked him away into a nearby building, where they locked him up in a cell. Why had he been brought here, and what was to become of him? Just 24 hours earlier, Oscar had been enjoying a peaceful dinner with his family. Now he found himself locked up in a cell, uncertain of his fate. 2 hours later, a man entered Oscar's cell, again fully packed with a white suit. He introduced himself as Alex, who claimed to work for a secret forces team. He apologized for the situation but insisted their actions had been necessary. Oscar's first concern was for his family, especially his son Henry. But Alex sighed, looked at the ground and said, "I have to tell you something." Oscar's heart raced as the words sunk in. He yelled, "What? What? What?" Was something happening to Henry? "It's about your son." Alex's voice was grave as he told Oscar that he needed to regain his composure. His son had fallen seriously ill after they had arrived at the facility. What kind of shell could give his son such a bad reaction? Alex explained that they had found a virus on the shell, but he wouldn't tell him more about it, insisting it was top secret. Another man entered the room and conducted a few tests on Oscar. A long and dreadful hour later, they received the results, and thankfully, Oscar was not infected with the virus. He was relieved and eager to finally see his son again. He prayed to God that he would be okay. Alex explained to Oscar he had to go through some protocols. He wasn't allowed to touch his son and had to wear a hazmat suit like everyone else. They told him his wife, Hilly, was still waiting on the test results, and if she were to be negative too, she would be joining him in their son's room. As Oscar walked down the long hallway, he bombarded Alex with questions, desperate for answers. What was the origin of the virus? Did it come from the shell? What kind of creature could possibly have lived inside it? After several minutes of silence, Alex finally opened up a bit. "I can't reveal everything to you, but since your son is severely affected, I'll give you some information." As Oscar walked into the room, he was struck with disbelief at the sight of his son lying in bed looking utterly drained and deathly pale. He was hooked to a machine, and fluid dripped through a tube. The question that kept haunting him was whether he would pull through this ordeal. The virus was not well understood, and survival rates were low, particularly for children the age of Henry. All they could do now was monitor him closely and hope for the best. Alex continued, "This virus is fairly new, and there have only been 3 cases known in the world. We're still testing various possible cures, but one really stands out. But we have no time to lose. We need to act fast, and you're the only one that can make the crucial decision." Alex suggested that if Oscar's blood was given to his son, his blood cells might adjust with Oscar's good blood cells, and it could possibly help save him. Without hesitation, Oscar agreed to do the blood transfusion and took a seat for the procedure. After they successfully filled the bag with Oscar's blood, they entered Henry's room and hung the bag of blood to let it drip into his veins. It was a waiting game now. Finally, Hilly arrived. She wore a white suit just like the rest, and they didn't want to make empty promises. After a few minutes, Alex and the other experts left the room, but Oscar wasn't done yet. So he followed them. Oscar was eager to know more about the shell, and Alex finally agreed to tell him everything. But on one condition, he had to sign a contract promising not to divulge the information to anyone. And without hesitation, Oscar immediately agreed. He couldn't wait to know what he was about to learn. Alex began to reveal information about the mysterious shell and the virus it carried, but Oscar sensed there was more to the story. The shell was, in fact, a turtle shell, and it was illegally imported into their country. It came from a continent where a new virus had just shown up, and it was infecting people worldwide. Not many people had gotten sick yet, but they were already looking for a cure. However, there was one thing that none of them could comprehend, and that was how the shell ended up in Henry's room. Oscar really wanted to find out, but he knew this was not a priority right now. He knew he had to stay calm and find a way to save his son. What is going on with my son? Is he doing better? And the doctors had good news for him. Henry was doing a lot better. He asked Alex if he could see him, eager to be reunited with his little boy. They embraced, and Henry asked what had happened. He already looked a lot better than a few hours ago. He had to stay the night for observation, but if everything kept improving, he would be allowed to go home tomorrow. The next day, they asked if they could finally go home. But Alex told them that was a difficult situation because their house was still in lockdown and needed to be thoroughly cleaned. Instead, they provided a temporary home for Oscar and his family where they could stay until it was time for them to go home. Tell us what you think about this story and share it with your friends. It might inspire them and brighten their day.